Well, greetings, everyone. I see we have a really eclectic crowd on, including participants from the Netherlands. If you're out there, it'd be a pleasure to know where you're from. My name is Dave Crusoe. I'm with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, located in Atlanta. And this is a conversation about the use of play, learn, and socialize constructs to build a larger digital experience within the clubs that we serve. The By way of background, before I dive into the club background very briefly, the work that we do, the work that I do is as a media producer in addition to a researcher. So what you're going to see is a little bit of research coming from a few different worlds, including education, business, and gaming. You're also going to see the application of that within the specific context that is club. So very briefly, just to tell you about the context that is club. The first Boys and Girls Clubs, which are places where young people can go originally when their parents were away at work. Now they're places where young people can go after school. So after 3 o'clock, and typically between 3 and maybe 8 or 9 o'clock. The first of those clubs was founded in 1860 in Connecticut, and it operated by itself. About 50 years later, they decided to come together to form a national organization, which is who I'm with. At this point in history, it being 2017, there are 1,100 different nonprofit organizations that fall under our umbrella. They are independent entities, and there are a combined 4,200 physical clubhouse locations that those 1,100 organizations run and manage. So we, as you can imagine, serve a very disparate client base, and our model is federated, which in this case means that those individual 1,100 organizations have a great deal of latitude, which really then puts the burden on us, and that we have to create truly compelling experiences for the young people we serve through those organizations, because those organizations make the choice about what of what we produce they use. So what you're going to see today is, in fact, our work to think about the experience of a kid, and that is to play, to learn, and socialize, those things that clubs do really, really well and allow kids to do within their spaces, combined with what the magic of those clubs is. We call them ingredients of clubs. Those are fun, recognition, caring adults, high-yield activities, and opportunities. Fun, I think, needs no description, right? Recognition is something very specific to clubs. For a long time, it has looked like a pat in the back if a young person did something good. It also has more structured formats. So for instance, many clubs have the paper equivalent of digital badges on the walls. They'll say, hey, Johnny, you've done something really great today, or you did excellent work on your homework, or you got the winning run in baseball. We will put a star by your name on that particular category. So recognition is overt. Caring adults, that means that young people have adults to go to. They also have adults who help them answer questions or navigate their lives. And so those adults play a really important role within the club context. High yield activities, those are what an educator might think of as learning activities, but really they're project-based experiences through which young people engage in exploring content and producing some kind of output from it. There's a focus on actual tangible educational constructs like standards, but we don't rigorously adhere to specific educational standards themselves. So it's not like we say all kids who go to clubs will go through the K6 standards for XYZ. Instead, we build those standards into activities, and those are our high yield activities. Pardon me. And then opportunities. It's a really big deal for young people to have a safe place to go after school, especially in many of the communities where we serve them. It's an even bigger deal for those young people to have opportunities to explore things outside of their immediate communities. So for example, we help young people access scholarships. We help young people access youth conferences through something we call Keystone. What we want to do is help young people understand that the world that they live in, particularly the microcosm of the world, is much bigger than they can see. It's much larger than they know. We want to link opportunities to them so that they can apply what they've learned through their activities. They can apply with the help of caring adults, rather, to go do something further. So we think about those ingredients, and we think then about how we move from the physical experience of that. So for instance, a homework room or a sports time in gym to instead, in our case, creating digital architectures. Now, that's the Jetsons stuff we've all been thinking about these days, right? So the question about, what is a digital architecture is the digital experience that we live as we move through our life. You could say that our phones have created a very lightweight architecture around our life. We have the opportunity as clubs, because we have a specific context, to construct something much more designed. In fact, we have the opportunity to design a digital architecture that then brings out the 21st century Boys and Girls Club experience, and that's our work. So a bit of forward-looking, and some things that I'm describing to you in a few minutes may work. We hope they do. Some of those things may not work. But throughout those digital architectures, we're keeping the core activities of play, which is really pivotal and important within the club context, learn, which links to those high-yield activities, and socialize. And socialize, of course, is engaging in play and learn with friends. It means that the things kids do are inherently social in nature. So our work and the work of the team I lead is to figure that out for the Boys and Girls Clubs movement. How do we create digital architectures across those 4,200 clubs? How do we make those architectures really compelling so that young people have better outcomes because of their experience at club? Now, to do this work, we had to ground ourselves in research. And I'm sorry, I'm going to geek out a second. This is a personal favorite of mine. I love the research here. We had to define visitor experience. And visitor experience, and pardon while I read this, but basically is the ongoing result of the interplay between a visitor's purpose or reason for visiting, including expectations and then the experiential aspects of a visit. So this includes personal and social engagement that occurs before, during, and after an individual transacts within a place or a space. Note that there are 3 phases here, before, during, and after. Now, in the case of clubs, just as in the case of schools or in the case of other areas, museums, retail, and so on, a person goes for a reason. As a young person, I would go to a club because either A, my parents have told me I have to go if I'm 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, or B, if I'm a little older, because I want to go. That's really important. And it's important to know as one is constructing programs why someone is there. In the case of schools, unfortunately, maybe in the US, and I'll editorialize, kids go because they have to, and that shades all of the other interactions they have while they're there. What we want to do through our work is to create the visitor experience where kids want to go because they're excited to go. And the question is, what role do technologies play? During, of course, makes sense. During a visit, young people can do things and engage. And then after is something we can't forget. After is when people talk with other people about what they've experienced. So we broke this down to make it visible. This is a model for digital visitor experience, something we're working through. You can see again the visit and the post. And I'll drill in here just a little bit to the visit because there are some components that work on, or rather that we're applying to the technologies and the game structures that we're working with. So personal sensory is what people experience when they walk into a place. Does it smell good? Is it bright? Experiential is the same. So what kinds of things are they doing? What are their activities? Peer interactions, that's socialize. We think play, learn, socialize. Peer interaction is largely the socialize. That takes place within a construct that's a set of rules and other governances created by staff. Some of those are larger policies. Others are narrower facilitated experiences within a learning engagement, a high-yield activity. So for instance, the rules of a space would be no using phones, and the facilitation would be no using phones during the session where we're learning about math. And the physical space, of course, is a much larger building at a building level. What does this evoke? Now, another thing to draw your attention to here is how digital plays a role. Note that it's not compartmentalized. Note that it's longitudinal, because technologies now, if you think about all of our work, play a role from the very beginning of when we capture someone's interest or when we have the opportunity to motivate them, all the way through the visit and through the post-visit. So think about an experience you had recently. Maybe you found a restaurant on Chowhound. I'm dating myself here, Yelp, I guess. So you found a restaurant on Yelp and you thought, okay, so my motivation to go is that it has great reviews. You go there and your sensory experience is that it's noisy, it kind of stinks, and the food doesn't taste good, and the facilitation, the staff engagement is not optimal. Your post visit is going to be to go home and then tweet or tell people about it on whatever social media you use and say, hey, this place is not so great. So unfortunately, that's a great example of this mechanic, but maybe they need to improve their experience. The last thing to note before I move on is the outcomes that we're achieving as an organization, just as schools, and in fact, many educational interventions, those interventions take place over time. Outcomes are achieved through repeated visits and not through a single visit alone. That's particularly true of educational environments in which young people have to have the accumulated experience, accumulated experience from those staff who engage them or from those educators who teach them to motivate them to go on. It's very rare that you'd see one single instance, unless it were an extremely strong instance, creating true change. So what are we building? How do we get out of this research realm into the realm of what we are doing? What do these structures actually look like when we put them into action? This September, we're launching a whole portfolio of digital youth engagement materials. Some of those are aimed at youth, others are aimed at staff, and still others are aimed at the actual infrastructure of club. So I'll cover these in turn. The youth tools at first are web and mobile web, but more importantly, they build on those high yield activities I spoke of before. So the high yield activities are the core. And you'll note in here, it looks a little like a learning management system. It basically is. The idea is that the activities within the learning management system, which are designed to be a lot less schooly than, say, school, branch out into the three areas we've talked about: play, learn, and socialize. So for instance, an example activity for youth could be to learn about online safety basics. So very clearly that, as facilitated by staff or as walked through by youth, is rather explicit, right? That's something that youth might do and build as an outcome, a poster that talks about online safety. Maybe they'll hang that on their wall, again, focused on that recognition factor. But something else that they might do, in fact, is engage in playing the Sky game. And the Sky game is something we produced recently with a few great outside partners. And the concept of Sky game is to learn about financial literacy, but through the mechanic of purchasing, or rather making decisions as a youth, as a young adult, as an older adult, both financial and educational. So if I make an educational decision about going to college, I accrue debt, my island might sink. That's an example of a game embedded within the environments that we're creating that will then lead to rewards. I'll talk about that. A third example of gaming is even more explicit. It's external of anything we've produced, but Just Dance is something very popular in clubs. It's very social, obviously, and young people love it. So it's something that we engage in within the club context. Now, young people engage in these activities from explicitly educational, like the digital safety activity in which they create a poster, somewhat educational and somewhat entertainment, as the Money Matters Sky game is postured, and then very playful, obviously Just Dance, which has young people moving, but maybe not learning anything explicit other than how to do something that I can't do, which is move to the sound of music here in a quality way. But as they do that, we move into recognition. I mentioned that was a big component of how we've designed our experience at clubs. The recognition is achieved first through digital badges. Digital badges, as I'm sure many of you understand, are signifiers of an accomplishment. For us, the signifier of accomplishment is such that a staff is the gatekeeper. I mentioned staff playing a role here. Staff play the role of gatekeeper in assigning badges to young people when they have accomplished something specific. So for example, I mentioned the digital safety, the online safety poster. We're young people to create an online safety poster that met the criteria that we've established within an activity you've posted on the wall. The staff would do have a way to issue an online safety badge that indicates that that young person has had that experience to a level that we've set out, a set of criteria we've set out. The laddering of badges is such that we have currently 3 levels. We have stars that are very granular. We have badges that are clusters of stars. So for instance, were I to create 2 posters, I might earn a whole badge. And then a master badge, which is the culmination of many badges. So for instance, here, if a young person completed all 4 rather digital literacy activities, online safety, digital privacy, digital security, and typer, which has to do with someone communicating, then they would earn a master badge. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would people, young people work toward badges? This is something that we've been speaking with many of the badging organizations with over a long time. Motivation, going back to that mechanic, is something really important to keep in mind. Unfortunately, the motivation for a digital badge is typically extrinsic. It's something that other people are telling kids to do, as opposed to something that kids organically want to do. Clubs have something special, and that is that I mentioned. We have lots of cool things that we can reward people with, we can recognize people with. Now, in the past, that was all ad hoc, right? So this individual club here pictured might have realized that these 2 young people were, because of their participation, able to gain a t-shirt. Now, at a national level, we have a system that applies badging to be able to do the same. So we'll be using some really cool just-in-time delivery technology to say that, if these 2 young people were to earn the sports badge, I'll make that up, they would, a week later have a t-shirt drop shipped to them and they'd receive it in the mail. So that's a system that we're putting into place probably about January of next year. It's an evolution of that digital badging. The thing that we really want to do is actually not hand out $100 bills, I'm sorry, but in fact, hand out scholarships. And what we need to do that is be able to match the scholarships that we receive and the opportunities we receive as a national organization with those young people who are in fact working toward those scholarships. So we'll be taking the structures of badge earning within the spaces that we cover. We have many topics within our programs to indicate that when a young person has met a certain level of their work, they then qualify for scholarships. Now, I wish I could say we were handing out $100 bills. Easily we have to set certain bars. So our work over the course of really 2018 is going to be to figure out what those bars are and then prototype those so we can get a sense of how many young people can meet those criteria, while keeping in mind that we want to hand out, a quantity of scholarships to young people to help them access higher education. So I'd say that now our work is, towards September, our work is to get the minimum viable product suite into play. And then in 2018 is to make refinements and add on some of these more tangible rewards. Now, staff are an ally. I mentioned that. Staff do and are constantly a part of the equation. We've built a set of technologies for staff, depending on how much depth they need. We have infrastructures that let them approve members. So for instance, if you're a member and you come into club, you can't automatically get a scholarship. We have to know who you are. The only way we can know who you are is if a staff member tells us that you are indeed a legitimate youth. So that's the first action. Second is badge approval. So for instance, if you're a young person and you create that poster, we would love to say, and we may even test, hey, I can signify that I've created that thing myself. But the work product is a poster, and the best person to understand whether that has actually been a 2-minute poster or a 25-minute poster that merits real work is the staff. And so the staff have the option to issue badges. And then finally, projects. Projects are the things that youth create. There's a lot of concern about which media are shown publicly in association with which clubs. So project approvals, to say that a project that a member has created and made public within that set of technologies, the web and the mobile platform, whether that should be truly public is also up to staff. And that also enables staff to mitigate issues related to cyberbullying, other material that might get out into the vast internet. So staff play a strong role. The piece that is, I think, exciting, and I really want to point people to as something to think about, is not, the idea of giving kids a learning website. That's been done. Is not giving staff a way to manage what youth do in schools. That's been done as well. The area where we can really break ground, I think, is this bigger idea of an experience, a set of digital architectures that create experience. In our case, that's club experience. So we're launching two things related to that in September. One is digital signage. We're finding ways to use Raspberry Pi devices, which are like low-cost computing devices, with big screens that we can, help clubs access relatively inexpensively to stream the activity from their work into that physical environment. So we can say, if you're a young person and you get a badge, hey, your picture goes onto the screen. We can recognize you. If you're a young person and you produce a piece of media, like a picture for a photo contest, we can put that on the screen. If you're a photo contest winner, we can put that on the screen as well. And we can show that nationally on all the screens in all the clubs. So you really get a lot more exposure. So the idea of this set of digital architectures, beginning with digital signage, is something we're exploring. But I really want to be a little more responsive than that. I'm afraid that digital signage is cool. We have the opportunity, because we have tactile interfaces now, to do a whole lot more than that. So what you see in front of you is a second piece of technology that was actually prototyped over the last week. I'm sorry, it looks really rough, because we're working on the prototype as of last Friday. This is a way for young people to enter a club and tap on a touchscreen to let club staff know how they're feeling. So imagine this near the door. You walk in the door and you say, hey, are you energetic today? If so, yellow or red. Are you feeling pleasant? Are you feeling good? So maybe I'm feeling great. I'm green. The idea is that as educators, or even as designers outside of the education environment, our challenge is to respond not only to what young people know and are able to do, the content knowledge, but to respond to how young people are feeling on a particular day. If my challenge is to teach something to kids and they're feeling terrible on Tuesday, it's going to be really hard to reach them. I want to start by breaking the ice to understand how they're feeling. Well, here on this screen, you can see the majority of kids are feeling like really pleasant and highly energetic, right? Most of the dots are in the upper quadrants there. So instead, I can approach, maybe those 2 or 3 youth who are in the lower left bottom to say, well, you're not feeling so good. Let's pull you aside and work with you. So it's a tactile interface that we can include into the environment. Now, tactile interfaces themselves aren't new. It's exciting for us because we can start to introduce these into the environment that is the Boys and Girls Club clubhouses, and build this digital layer over what for so long has been a physical experience alone. So I hope that gives you a sense of how this year we're launching technologies, really a platform that links the ideas of play, learn, and socialize with those ingredients of club, being fun, recognition, caring adults, high-yield activities, and opportunities. It has been really a pleasure for us to produce those pieces of media, but there's something we know, and that is that the media aren't yet enough. We have a challenge, right? So many of our clubs look a bit like this. They're deeply physical spaces. So one of our challenges is infrastructure, in that we have to help our organizations access radically different sets of infrastructure to be able to include these digital ingredients throughout their experience. Some clubs have that already. Some clubs are so equipped. This is a picture of another one. You can see it's very different in execution, very modern. You can see some of that built-in infrastructure is there, like the screen, the front desk where that touch display might exist. You can imagine that there's Wi-Fi throughout this building. So we do have those ingredients. We have a big change, though. One change that's relevant to all of us, other than architecture of the physical space, is the architecture of the policies and the practices that make a space come alive. Recently, some colleagues were traveling, and they saw this sign on the door of the place they were traveling to. And the story is that one of them had to entertain the group they were with so that the other could sneak off and capture this picture. I want to draw your attention to the very top and then the very bottom. It says computer lab rules, and the very bottom says no downloading anything, no YouTube, no music sites, and no internet. Reflect on that. I hope you're chuckling, because I am when I read that. Um, the world of the young person is not here today. The world of the young person is YouTube. The world of the young person is music, perhaps even through or probably through YouTube. And the world of the young person is internet, even if they don't realize that what they're doing is participating in the networks that compose this much larger set of networks called the internet. So our evolution, probably an evolution for many of you, is to evolve the policy paradigm and the practice paradigm. I'll break those out very quickly. The policy paradigm are those pieces of paper that stipulate what I can and cannot do. So for instance, if I'm able to use my phone in an environment, because I have signed a piece of paper that says that if I use my phone and I do something bad, I'm in trouble, well, that's a policy, normally called here in the US a bring your own device policy. Many of our clubs have policies, and they say you may not use your device in our club. So that's a challenge that we're trying to overcome, because our scaler, our technology scaler, really is youth device. That's the only way we can achieve parity with respect to the number of youth and the number of computing devices in those environments. But I'll tell you what, creating the policy paradigm isn't enough. If I said to a person who runs a club, hey, tomorrow tomorrow all of your young people should use their devices, they would say, that's great, but what do I do with them? How do I manage them? And so that's the practice. Now, the practice in our environment, we've actually been inspired, we've built with inspiration from schools. So our practices are things like our shared cultural practices of, hey kids, raise up your devices so I can see them, or put your screens down, take your devices out of your bag or put them back into your bag. Then the final two, one is safe word, so a word that young people can use if they've seen something on those devices that might constitute cyberbullying. They have to talk about with an adult. The final is no paparazzi, which is I don't want my photo taken, but for real. There's often misinterpretation of who wants their photo taken when, so having a safe word, a power word that gives youth and staff a way to stop that from happening is part of the practice. Now, practices can be different. In a school environment, those are maybe a little bit similar. If it were a store environment or a museum environment, the practices of using media in those spaces would be a bit different. But still, even within, say, a museum, if you're that kind of a designer, there would be a policy that says this is what people can do, like use of cameras or not. And then a set of practices accustomed, like please don't use flash, but you can use your camera. So that's something that we have to think about, and it really is a dynamic duo. Those things have to work together. The final piece here is measurement. We can create all the great stuff in the world, but we really have to understand what it's doing. We want to make sure that there is a return on our investment. So we've started with a set of core statistics, and then we've evolved them with experiential statistics. So the core statistics are ones that are probably very familiar to everyone. So for instance, the number of visits, or the number of stars, or the number of registered users, the number of recognitions that are issued. Those are statistics that we're all looking at. Are people coming to what we have to give them? Are they registering and creating accounts? Are they coming back to use their accounts? And are they issuing badges? Are these things that people are actually using? Number of stars at minimum dosage as well, and minimum dosage for our case is probably 2 logins. We're still defining that. Those are metrics that can tell us people are using something or not. The tool of formative evaluation, which is a very different tool, might tell us if people are not using it, why not, or what else can we do to make it better. But then we have a set of metrics that are experiential, and those are the metrics at the bottom here. So ease of use. I feel blank is easy to use. Fun. I have fun using blank. Online interaction. I feel like my ideas count when I post them on blank, or I feel safe using blank. Caring adults when using blank, a technology. Staff notice when I try hard. And then finally, recognition. I'm rewarded when I do a good job. Now you're going to notice similarity there to the structures earlier of play, learn, socialize, and recognition, caring adult, fun, etc. And that's because as an organization, what we really want to do is promote fun, caring adults, etc. And so it's really important that the tools, the digital structures we're creating under that physical experience ladder right into the ways that we are designing digital experiences to layer. We have to measure that. So what you see here are our youth experience measures. Um, and so it's really important to understand these as a final factor. Now, to talk about relevance, because this is what we've been doing, but I do want to bring it home. A common audience here, let's apply it to schools very quickly. Common audience is a school. School is a physical building, guess what, where people go. That sounds a lot like clubs. They engage in learning activities, guess what, similar to what we're doing. And they're expected to go there. So if we think about that mechanic from earlier, their motivation for going maybe is not too strong unless it's a fun school, in which case I'd love to go too. During the visit, many schools are dark. Their windows are very small and maybe purposely shaded so that kids don't get distracted. Unfortunately, research tells us that that detracts from the learning environment. Maybe the lunchroom is causing odors, and so that's not fun. They're places where things are compartmentalized too. There's a benefit and a challenge, right? So the benefit of compartmentalization, say, of learning technologies is that young people might be using some really cool tools within a math classroom or within a social studies classroom. The detriment is that there's no common experience across those rooms. And so this is a picture I've just pulled from the nets. And you can see, here in the front, young person is using two devices at once. There are some computers in the background. The space itself is maybe a little cluttered, although we could talk about that one. The question for us as a designer is, what should that experience be? What is, if we could start over, what does that learning experience look like within the school context? What is our Jetsons version of the K-12 school? Or what is the Jetsons version of how digital layers within that school? Would it, in our Big Sky version, would it look like this, or would it look a little different? And so thing number one I want to leave you with to think about is dream and experiences, not tools. And maybe I was missing something, but in my past I've been dreaming of tools, and tools were very narrow. They said, I want to help a young person learn how to analyze data. I want to help a young person learn how to search the web. I want to help a young person learn how to analyze the veracity of information on the web. But those weren't synthesized into a larger experience. They weren't synthesized into an experience in a context. And they really didn't ladder into bigger objectives other than their narrow learning objectives, which are good, by the way. But that bigger experience, I think, is critical to think about. So thing number one, dream and experiences. What is that experience you want someone to have? Thing number two is develop or utilize a model. We found this really useful. And I draw you back to this. I'm not saying this is perfect. I've drawn inspiration in what you see here from museum visitation. They think a lot about this in their literature, and retail store visitation. They as well think a lot about the pre-visit, or they call it the pre-purchase, the purchase, and the post-purchase. It's something we really, as educators and education designers, even as game designers in those constructs or other constructs, really can think about. So for instance, if we're producing a game, we could equate that to the visit. What do we want the pre-gaming experience to be? How do we want to ladder people into that? Is it just a teaser and just a trailer? Do we want people to maybe encounter a few minutes of it? Do we want it, for people to do something else that really draws them in? And then afterward, what do we want them to say about it to their peers, their friends, their adults? How do we design that instead of just the tool? Thing number three, and we've all heard this before, but it's true, is prototype and fail fast. I won't belabor it. Paper works just fine. We've done quite a lot on paper for our own work before we even produce things that are digital. We've traveled around and run the paper boards by young people for games, for our digital technologies and the tools. Really fail fast and expect and help set expectations that things will work and things won't work. For those things that work, find out what can make them work better. For those things that failed, of course, find out what can make them work better, or maybe the idea itself needs to be evolved. Thing number four, I spoke of this a little earlier, is look carefully at the policy and the practice context, or rather policy and the practices that you want to grow so that your larger experience can actually come alive. I'll draw you back to the museums. The idea in museums is, yeah, I can use a camera, or I can use a phone, that in earlier ages would probably have been taboo. In our case as clubs, I'll give you an interesting story. Uh, in the 60s, I think, and I don't have the year, I'm sorry, there was actually a big conversation about whether TVs should be allowed in clubs. And ultimately, the decision was yes. But the inclusion of televisions in the club, which are now used to show movies and play video games, use Xbox and so on, that all started with a policy framework that said televisions were allowed in clubs and practices. Here are some ways to use televisions in your clubs. So even going back that far, we've been thinking about policies and practices as ways to encourage certain behaviors within educational contexts. And finally, measure experience. As educators or as gamers, game designers, we're interested in measuring certain outcomes. In some places in the education world, that's literally education outcomes are, at least in the US, are more kids doing better in school. In the gaming context, that might be sales. How many games, how many units are we selling? But really, the question is, at the heart of both of those, what is the experience that people are having? If people are having a poor experience in that school, well, no wonder they're not doing well. Or if the experience, the pre for the purchase of the game stinks, of course they're not going to purchase that game. Or maybe they're only going to play a few minutes of it. So really, measure the experience. In our case, that's fun. It's caring adults. It's recognition. In your cases, it might be a little different. But think carefully about how you measure in terms of not just the ultimate outcome, because that's great, but that's your outcome. Measure that experience, because that's really what you're trying to evoke to get to that outcome. So those are 5 takeaways that I hope are helpful. Those are things we've learned. What I really hope is that by watching this presentation, you can think about gaming and structures, badging, and so on, to apply not only to narrow tools you're building, but to that larger experience you want to grow. Ultimately, those are the moves you see in society now with respect to where stores are going. You see it with respect to where museums are going. You'll see it with respect to where households are going with the Echo and so on. So our question is, how do we fit into that Jetsons vision of what the future is to design not just tools for Leroy or anyone else within the Jetsons to use, but really so we can evoke this much larger world of an experience itself. So I hope that was interesting. We have about 15 minutes for questions if you'd like. You can hang out and chat, or if you'd prefer, you're more than welcome to reach out by Twitter or by email, depending on your preferred communication mechanism. I'm always glad to engage in more conversations about this. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dave. I thought that was really interesting. Are you going to give this specific presentation at the conference, or are you, I think earlier you were thinking about a different one?
It is different. We can talk. I can certainly tailor this. We've learned a lot along the way of doing this work, and so the conversation at the conference was a little bit different in that in terms of audience and understanding, we'd want to reach people with what they can do to be successful as they engage in this work. On the nonprofit, there are sort of 2 factors to that. On the nonprofit side, um, when we began our work, and we began this in late 2013, we had a set of assumptions about what we knew and what we didn't know. And the reality is that we didn't know a whole lot more than we knew, and we still know very little, I'll be honest. Um, but we made a lot of mistakes the first year and a half, and I'll take that on myself. So for instance, we didn't really have a vision of where we wanted to go. We were building many of our games outside of a larger experience. The result now, is seriously, is we have a couple interesting games, but they don't really fit, right? I mean, they look different, they feel different, they're used in different ways. That means we have to teach staff to use them differently. Um, and then, and also production side things. And very mechanically, on the nonprofit side, we get a 12-month grant that probably sounds familiar to many of you. Um, Things can't be made in 12 months and can't be refined in 12 months. So we've had to break out of that 12-month scale as we think about designing, iterating, and improving, implementing our work.
You have one of the listeners here who would like you, I think, to talk a little bit more about what were the mistakes that you made, and then what did you do, or what did you learn?
Oh, oh, absolutely. I'm so embarrassed. Yeah,
That's what the conference is all about, is sharing those mistakes as well as the success. Oh, Harry, maybe that wasn't the question?
I think maybe the conference is when he was alluding to it. Oh, no, I'm sorry, right. No, you're right. So not mistakes, the learning points. Mea culpa, caught, guilty as charged. We've had a variety, Harry, of great learning points along the way. I thank you for that. So, some of them really on the nonprofit side have been institutionally thinking about how we think about time. So how long it takes to get good things to market. Process, what process is best. Oftentimes, things begin with an idea and move right to a product without a lot of user input. So we've started to build really strong formative evaluation into our work in terms of process, but that takes time, and so then time extends. The role of outside vendors has shifted on the nonprofit side. So we've taken a lot more ownership over our work, as opposed to leaving sort of technology vision to external agencies. Those are some things that we've had to evolve internally, and also skill set, honestly. Many nonprofits, I'm assuming other organizations, particularly older ones, are built with IT departments that are designed to sustain an organization's infrastructure, like computing devices, but not really designed to pioneer new pieces of work fast. So for instance, the idea of like a 3-day dev cycle on the screen you saw earlier in the presentation for the mood meter, pretty much unknown, right? I mean, because things would take months to get approved and so on. So we're looking at evolving those processes. On the vendor side, though, we've had to help educate in variety and work with 7 or 8 or 9 now, different technology vendor types, including game design agencies, some of which might be watching this, and I know definitely several will be at the conference itself. Institute of Play, for instance, has been a fantastic partner throughout our work. And in working with them, though, they've had to understand that oftentimes the person leading a project is not a technology expert because of the way organizations are funded and teams are built. So liaising with others and really pushing from an outside point of in to make sure the right connections are there to ladder up to that bigger experience. That's been a critical piece of learning as a takeaway, and really is advice for outside vendors. Push hard to make things happen internally so they can get a clearer picture of what's going on. And then 2, present prototypes early, because the feedback rounds really can take weeks. So we've tried to lighten that. But those are 2 examples of learning we've had internally. A third is, in the world of technology, the idea of launching a minimum viable product and then having some runway to iterate constantly based on user feedback is pretty much standard, right? But in a space funded by 12-month grants, that's very different. So we've had to help educate vendors about the fact that we have a very short support cycle for a lot of the technologies we work with. Those are 3 sort of learnings we've had to distill outward as well. And so that was the content.
That's very helpful. Harry, go ahead and ask another question if you like. And my question relative to the conference is, you're welcome to do either. If you just decide to change the topic, I'm just about to get a press on the program, so I'll need to know if you had any changes, that's all.
Okay. When is that press date?
Pretty quick, the end of this week. Just for title.
Okay. Just for title. Got it. Okay. Oh my gosh, the $1 million question. Yeah, there. So the question is, has the project started with a problem? What was the problem space? Let me show you the problem space. Can I go back in my deck? That slide right there, but in a much more abstract way. Organizationally, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, Boys and Girls Clubs of America has been doing great work for 100 years. The challenge is that it has also been doing great work for 100 years. And the cultures of clubs are, in many cases, have been the same for a long time. So when we have a rapid technology change, really the growth of devices in the hands of young people, when we get into this space within the span of, unfortunately, what has been about 17 years, but really only about 7 or 8 in which devices are now ubiquitous, we have a really strange pressure in clubs. And that is that young people are coming to clubs with the expectation that they can be engaged in computing in some way. And I use computing very broadly as a term right now. So that could mean texting friends. That could mean taking photos. That could mean learning something using their device because they do that at school. Um, it could mean making media. Um, Young people are using digital tools as extensions of their uh, active cognitive processes. I don't know any other term for it. And clubs really weren't catching up with that. They were finding ways, and they really still are, compartmentalizing devices into very specific times, if at all, in that club experience. So they might say, young kids, when you come to club, put your device away at 4 o'clock, between 4 o'clock and 4:10. If you need to text your mom, you can, or you need to text your other caregiver, you can do that. To be clear, that's not all. We have some that really are engaged. In fact, we have some in Greater Washington that are engaged in a digital gaming in the esports league at this moment. But that's the exception, not the rule. So the problem space was, how do we move all of the 4,200 plus clubs into a time when, and into a digital engagement when those devices are used and applied safely, effectively, um, appropriately within that club day, so that we keep young people coming to the club. We want more young people coming to the club. We want more young people staying longer within the club. And we want them to say good things about their experience to other people. So the problem space was just that. How do we keep growing numbers? How do we keep growing impact through retention? And then how do we keep people saying good things? So really, it was a marketing challenge in a way. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, and if you have other questions, feel free to post. Otherwise, I'll just keep sort of jamming on that problem space. The project evolved. I won't belabor it, but basically, when we started, we came up with we looked up the Jetsons, and then we came up with this huge Jetsons vision, right? And it was enormous, and it was super cool. It was probably impossible. It had a very it was very significant. I'll put it that way. And in some ways, it was actually frighteningly significant. And so we found it more effective to come up with a much more subtle way of building technologies into club as supports, as opposed to an entirely new ecosystem of experiences that you might equate to, say, a virtual space alone, like a digital club. That would have been too big to bite off, as a first chunk. So the other piece of learning within that problem space was, when trying to solve a problem, don't start off necessarily by conflating it. Start off with something that's really practical and applicable as an appropriate solution. Be another
Harry must have had a lot of coffee tonight.
at 1 a.m. Nope, maybe not. Oh, wow, Harry. Yeah, you sir have good questions. Um, I'm going to unpack that because there's actually a lot there. Um, where to start? So I will bring you, I'll say all of the above, and then let me bring you back to a couple things here. And this is one of the complexities of our work. So in boys and girls clubs, the clubs themselves have both unstructured time and structured time. The unstructured time after school would be thought of as like games room time. So young people, engage in games in the games room, ping pong and so on. The structured time is time we call program time. And what you see in front of you on the screen, digital literacy, computer science, media making, other programs focus on leadership. This is structured, project-based building time, typically engaged in with staff. So a staff is going to say, today, let's learn about healthy eating, healthy habits. We have programs around that as well. So behavior change on the part of the programmatic content is and always has been a piece of what clubs do. In terms of what we're trying to achieve with our technologies, you can say that we are evolving the delivery mechanism for the behavior change experiences, programs, as delivered by staff. Traditionally, those have been books. Now it's digital. But that the primary behavior change that we've had to think about as a team is not the programmatic content, although we own a little bit of it. So digital literacy is ours, media making, computer science, those are ours. But primarily actually focused on the practice of using technologies within a club, two, on the policies of using technologies in a club. So our challenge, the behavior change on the part of both professionals and kids is twofold. We have both of those, and we want to change both of those. So on the part of kids, we want them to understand that they have agreed to ways to use technology, agreed upon ways to use technology. That's the policy side. The practice side is that they understand the expectations and the cultures of using those technologies within their club space. Now that can look one of two ways. It can look like the Wild West, so there's no control over it, which leads to, or can spawn things like cyberbullying, which can happen anywhere. I'll be serious. But one could make the case that it's more prevalent in a place where the digital cultures are not strong, where the expectations of how people use technologies are weak. And also for staff, we want them to understand that it's okay for things to happen. I mean, rather okay for people to use their devices, that they have ways to use them, which are the technologies and tools we're creating, because we can say they were created specifically for them. But we also need to equip them with the practices of doing that. And so the practices are what they use to then implement those programs. So if I had to make a case around it, I could say, or give a sketch around it, I could say, as a staff, I understand that when young people walk in the door, they will tap on a screen that tells me their mood. As a staff, I understand that when people tell me their mood, I need to be able to use my own device to look at what they're telling me, how they're telling me they feel. As a staff, when I engage in media making with young people, I can ask them to take their devices out. I can ask them to work with their friends to shoot a movie on their device, and I can ask them to upload it or edit it. Those are, I think, the bigger behavior changes that we have to talk about. The programmatic changes are no less a focus of the organization as a whole, without question. But with my team specifically, we're more focused on the behavior changes of how people use digital and where they use digital within the club concept. So I'm sorry, it basically is an answer to you, which is everything. But unfortunately, reality is everything. It's just that different parts of the organization are focused in different places.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. I thought it was great. Really.